Hello, everyone, and welcome. Wherever you are, we hope that you are safe and healthy. My name is David Goldwyn. I am chairman of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Centers Advisory Board and a fellow at the Adrienne Arce Latin America Center. It's a real pleasure today on behalf of both those organizations to welcome you to today's launch of the Atlantic Council's new report, Colombia's Shale Resource Potential. To launch the report, we've assembled a terrific panel for you. John Padilla, the author of this excellent report, who's managing director at IPD Latin America, Ambassador Francisco Lloreda, president of the Asociación Colombian de Petróleo, and also a former ambassador of Colombia to the Netherlands, and Catherine Spector, longtime energy expert, now a consultant with Prospector Energy Advisors. I want to remind everyone that this session is on the record. And following a brief presentation from John, we will open the floor to questions. We turn to our panel for a moderated discussion, and then to the rest of you for questions. You can submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll try and get to as many as I can, either filtering them into the moderated discussion or afterwards. If you're following the event on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we can't take your questions. But if you are online, we encourage you to use the hashtags at AC Global Energy and at AC Latin America. So that's it for the housekeeping. Let me say it's a real privilege to be talking about Colombia and its shale sector. Colombia as a nation, I think, has always punched above its weight when it comes to oil and gas production. They've had flexible frameworks, they've adjusted with the times, not an enormous resource base, but they have really made the most of it. And back in 2012, I was part of an effort when Colombia first started looking at these unconventional resources. And with the World Bank and others, they really undertook a world-class, I think best-in-class effort to look at everyone who was producing shale, everyone who banned shale, every NGO that was concerned about it, and learned all the science about keeping water, air safe and avoiding induced seismicity. And despite that and a great set of regulations, the challenges of building trust and confidence in the country have remained. And that's really what's remarkable about this report is it looks into the changes in that framework and how Colombia is trying to build trust and confidence in the sector and their efforts to do so. So I'm going to turn the floor over to John, and he's going to explain in what is a very thorough, very careful, very dispassionate report what the new framework is like in Colombia and whether it will work. And then we'll have a conversation about whether this time is different. So with that, John, let me turn it over to you.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, fantastic. Just having some audio problems on my front, but as long as everybody can hear me, that's fantastic. It's a pleasure to be joining you and appreciate everybody coming out to listen in onto this, the launch of the policy paper. So I think there's a big question for people that are outside of Colombia in terms of why now. And I think unconventionals in the current framework, as we're talking about energy transition, is an interesting question, particularly as we're all sitting at home and we have, I think people in urban communities have certainly have been growing much more accustomed to blue skies, et cetera. And the Colombia situation is, as you'll see in the policy paper that I've written, really tries to explore some of the nuances that are in place in Colombia. It's not a simple discussion by any stretch, and so I apologize up front that the report is a little bit lengthy, but it really tries to delve into not only the legal issues that you have, but the political considerations, the economic considerations, the local community issues, which are frequently discussed, whether you're looking at extractive industry in Colombia, anywhere else in the region, or anywhere else in the world, as well as some of the environmental issues. And environmental issues are obviously one that are incredibly sensitive in Colombia. There's a long history of those issues, and so it's one of the things where we've seen quite a bit of folks that are quite opposed to that, because Colombia, in terms of water, in terms of its green environment, et cetera, is something that they're quite worried about. And so the issue here, though, is what I'd like to try to use the couple minutes that I have is just to put some things in context. And that is that over the last 20 years, Colombia has attempted to bid out number of blocks in conventional resources. There was tremendous amounts of activity that led production to increase to roughly 1 million barrels per day in 2013, 2015. That has now slid over the last few years, and we're now under 750,000 barrels per day. Oil prices have an incredibly meaningful impact in Colombia. And the big takeaway is that the government and the economy overall is incredibly dependent on those revenues. And it's something that there's not been very significant discussion on. Here under the pandemic with COVID-19, Colombia has increased its debt pretty significantly. It's now 60% to debt to GDP, and the risk of rating downgrades is high. So in that context, we have these PPIs, these pilot projects that are being launched, and the timing of this event couldn't be any better. So we will, over the course of the next month, have bids awarded for those pilot projects. And the argument that I put forward in the paper is simply that we need to test those out. We need to see if this can be done in a very environmentally safe and sustainable kind of way. There's significant issues and challenges that need to be addressed. And what I've attempted to do is really kind of look at that and disclose what those items are. So I think that the challenges for Colombia are, if it's not going to come from the extractive industries, where is that revenue going to come from? And that is a very, very meaningful conversation that needs to be had. It can't be in an isolated box. And right now, the reason that unconventionals are being discussed, and we've been at this now for 8 years, is because that resource potential is 2.7 to 4.6 times larger than the conventional resources that Colombia has. So if it doesn't come from here, then where is it going to come from? And that's what these pilot projects are really all about. So I think I'll probably stop for there, and I'm going to see if I can try to get sound back, and but we can go from there.
Great. Thanks, John. That was terrific, and I'm hearing you loud and clear. So so at least on our side, that's all good. So a question for you, and then a question for Francisco. I guess the main question for you, John, is with this new scheme, with the new PPIs, either do you think it will be different this time? Do you think that the government will be able to get public acceptance, and if so, why? Or if you're not certain, what's it going to take in order to build that confidence? And then Francisco, I'm going to turn to you and ask you about the politics, which is so just a heads up there. But first, you, John, what will it take in order for this time to be different? So we may have lost John for a second there. So while John's contemplating, Francisco, maybe I can turn to you for a second and ask you about the politics. It seems like successive Colombian governments have been in favor of this unconventional development, but the agricultural and indigenous communities where the production will take place are not. Is it they are of one party or a different party, or is this really more of a local issue than a political issue?
Well, thank you very much, David, for your question. There is a clear paradox, and that is that the people that oppose fracking are not usually the communities where the pilot projects will take place. Some of them have some questions, but they're not the ones opposing fracking. The opponents are mainly people from outside those regions that have seen in fracking like a nice political flag based mainly on their political and ideology rather than technical, environmental, and economic knowledge. So that's why what we've been trying to do is to promote a discussion based on scientific and technical support instead of the political and emotional discourse. So that's mainly what is happening.
So let me press you on that just a little bit, because I recall, in 2012 or so, 2012, 2013, even though the president and the Ministry of Energy, the government of the day, was in support of unconventionals, the Ministry of Environment was not. So, I mean, I understand that there are outside groups doing it, but there must be a domestic political constituency which has some salience in order to create this kind of opposition. So where is that coming from?
Well, David, you just said, and it is that the Santos government, who benefited the most from the oil boom, had like different views on fracking, because while it enacted the regulation that the country needed, and this industry was part of its economic plan, what happened afterwards is that when it requires to take some decisive steps, it did not follow through. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that Duque, who was hesitant on fracking during the electoral campaign, decided to gather together like a group of experts. And this group of experts, as you know, recommended some pilots. And I have no doubt at this moment that the government is fully committed with these pilots. As we can see, it has issued in record time most of the regulation. Ecopetrol is on board. So let's hope that the bread does not burn in the oven door this time around.
John, let me come back to you now, and really two questions. In the report, you talked about the new royalty scheme, and you also talked about the importance of the government having a strong communications plan with the public. So I guess my question for you is, what is your top line list of what has to happen in order for these projects to succeed?
So, yeah, great question, David. I think it absolutely starts with the political will. And political will is something that has been not at the forefront of this process. And I think it ties in very closely with royalties, because when you don't have that doesn't have subsurface rights, the issue that you run into is then how do you communicate, how do you create that kind of connection between either the federal and state level, or in the case of Colombia, the national and the departmental level. And so, a lot of people say, well, the communities aren't really interested in these projects, and I would actually push back on that. I think, contrary to that, what we've seen is that the Middle Magdalena is actually a region that has a very long history of production. It's actually the source of where first production in Colombia took place. So there's over 100 years of experience in that sector. They understand the business, and it has actually generated some of the best paying jobs out there. And I think what's interesting with unconventionals is that it's much more of a manufacturing process. And so the need for infrastructure, the need for other pieces is really quite critical. So in terms of top priorities, I would say the political will. Then we do absolutely have legal overhang. So there continues to be a moratorium on the commercial production of unconventionals, and there still is a pending lawsuit with respect to the pilot projects itself. So those will have the biggest impact. With respect to royalties, I think royalties actually raised a very critical issue, because the new royalty law was passed in December 2019, but the regulation then didn't come into effect until August. When that went into session, they chose to eliminate the 40% royalty reduction that was put in place back in 2000, and sanctity of contracts, we have seen some incidents, which I talk about in the report, that have pushed back against that. And that's very vital for unconventional activity, because one of the things that these guys are going to be looking at, anyone that enters into these pilot projects is going to be investing millions of dollars, and they're going to want a certain level of certainty in terms of what are the next steps, what's going to happen, and how do they get to a actual commercial project. So royalties is and then the other component of that is how commercially viable are these projects without that royalty incentive. So all of that is only going to be played out until once we test the rocks and once companies go in there and check that out. But the bottom line is that companies are going to want certainty, and that's something that Colombia is going to have to work at. And it's going to be really critical that goes into not only the PPBIs or the pilot projects, but also the actual decrees and regulations that come afterwards.
Great. Before I turn to Catherine and ask her about how investors are going to look at this, let me ask you on the royalties. I mean, as you pointed out earlier, that when subsurface rights belong to the government rather than to the private property owner, it's a lot harder to do unconventionals anywhere. Here, there's a scheme for sharing a share of the royalties with the poor, with the local community, with the regions. Has anyone run the numbers on what the size of the prize is in the pilot phase or later on? What are we talking about in terms of the amount of money that would go to the locality, and is it enough? I think Francisco, you may have had a beat on that.
Okay, thank you, David. First, I will say that we expect that the new royalty scheme will help. And yes, we have some like revenue projections on regarding pilots. If the 4 pilot projects go into a commercial phase, and that's what we expect, what we see is that this would represent like annual investments of $5 billion per year. That represents like 2% of GDP in Colombia. And what we see is that in the next 25 years, we would see revenues of more than $30 billion for Colombia, 10 billion coming from royalties. So that's why we think that it is very important to go ahead with the pilot projects. And these figures that I've been sharing with you are only with those 4 pilot projects going into production phase. So there's an enormous potential, we think, in conventionals, and the country needs it. As John was saying, there are not many options that we have. And also, and I think that John was very clear on that, it is those requirements that John highlighted. First, political will. Second, legal security, among others, are critical at this stage.
Thank you. Catherine, let me turn to you. And I guess it really a couple of questions. One is, looking at the global market for oil and gas, what kind of demand is there for Colombian oil and gas? And then with your analyst hat on, taking the perspective of investors, what are going to be the key challenges from their point of view when they view the investment opportunities in Colombia?
Sure. Well, there's certainly a generic market context here that would apply to any oil or gas investment at the moment. And within that, oil and gas, I would say, have different stories. When it comes to oil, obviously, there's been a massive hit to global oil demand because of the pandemic, and that is both directly in terms of reduced movement, but also indirectly because of the resulting economic slowdown. But even before the pandemic, there was already pretty broad consensus that long-term oil demand is approaching a peak. There's a lot of debates around the exact details of that, but that is broadly the consensus. And this thesis really favors low-cost producers, of course, but I would also say producers with what I would call a niche or integrated marketing relationship. So for example, oil production is specifically tied to a certain petrochemical operation that will use that oil as a feedstock. So I would say, in general, having an idea in advance about where newly developed oil is going to go or how it will be marketed makes investors feel more confident. With respect to natural gas, I would say there's less consensus, but also broadly, definitely more optimism around long-term global natural gas demand. But there's also, of course, as we know, a lot of competition on the supply side. And the real complicating factor here for gas development, I think, is just how capital intensive it is to sell gas internationally as LNG. Gas producers that don't have an adequate domestic or continental market, meaning a market that you can reach with a pipeline, really do have to take the long view here and be prepared for some very significant capital investments ahead of revenue generation. And at least in the near to medium term here, they're going to be taking that investment leap into a pretty crowded market. So that's the big picture. I think with respect to Colombia specifically, as you've already mentioned, Colombia has a lot going for it. It's not their first time to the ball. They have a sort of a pre-existing government legal infrastructure. Foreign investors are familiar with Colombia. But the challenges that remain, I would say there are two big ones that I would point to. One is that in terms of supply of capital to the sector overall, bargain hunting in the US may distract potential investors from Colombia. And then the other that I would point to is just this idea of finding a market. Where can Colombia's new oil and gas go? And has that really been sort of strategized?
Great, thanks. And Francisco, maybe you want to comment on that. I know Ecopetrol is going to be a big player in this, but is there a large percentage of the oil and gas produced that will be for domestic consumption as well as for export? How do you see it internally?
Yes, David, it is although it is hard to say how the hydrocarbon demand will behave when the pilot projects go into a production phase. As it was mentioned earlier, Colombian proven reserves are quite limited. So at this moment, what we see is that we will be needing not only gas from unconventionals first for the domestic market, domestic use, and afterwards perhaps for exports. But in the case of oil, we need these resources not only for domestic use but also for exports, because the country is highly dependent on resources from the oil business, and so that's why we need these resources, and also because in Colombia we have some very interesting and promising projects offshore, for example, but they will take some time, and we don't know what the gas market will be like in 5-10 years time. So that's why I was saying that the only option that we have really is unconventionals. We haven't been able to find to discover important plays in conventional plays in the past 3-4 decades.
Can I jump in here, David?
Sorry, please.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here. I think there's one interesting dynamic that may be a little bit lost on a broader audience. And that is that natural gas is a commodity that is increasingly being used in Colombia, but at the same time, its reserves have been going down. So they actually dropped to so reserves to production dropped to 8.1 years this last year. And that was down from 9.9 years the year before. That was a pretty dramatic decrease. Also, the price of natural gas here is quite attractive. So let's just call it, for argument's sake, $5 an MMBTU. Well, I mean, if you're in the Permian Basin, you would be loving to be getting those kind of prices. So there's lots of discussion, and I think the pandemic is actually doubling this down, which is that the export market is going to be much more challenging. And for countries like Colombia, like the rest of Latin America, the need to create domestic consumption becomes much higher. So there is discussion, or there is a bid going out right now for a regasification facility in Buenaventura on the Pacific coast. And the reason is because to get gas from essentially Cusiana, Cupiagua down to Cali, which would be the first principal market that you would be looking at, the transportation costs are off the charts. They're incredibly high. So gas has the ability to create a lot of economic development and infrastructure build out, which is what Colombia is really in the kind of dilemma of trying to face right now. So this is not just an export driven discussion or dilemma. This is very much a domestic discussion and dilemma that really needs to be taken into consideration and understood. So
especially in the case of gas, John, in the case of gas, it is initially domestic dilemma. In the case of oil, is both domestic and also for exports.
Yeah, because the domestic consumption here is 350,000 barrels per day. Even at lower production levels here, you're still exporting, let's call it 400,000 barrels per day, 400 to 500,000 barrels per day. And the transportation costs, the logistics here, the topography that you have are very high. That's a whole different other discussion that you could get into. But the point is that you're not going to know what those break-even points are. And I think there was a question from my friend Stephen Butson on what kind of prices you're looking at. The problem is that it's just right now. I think it's too early to say. What we do know is that the resource is about as good as you can get globally, and the question then becomes is what kind of oil to gas ratio that do you have, and how cheap can you bring it to market?
Great. Well, thanks. So we've talked about Colombia's need for the export revenues. We talked about their need for domestic supply, and we've talked about sort of the attempt both to have compelling royalties for investors and sharing revenues with the locality to build trust. But let's talk about two other things that are related to this issue. And the first is health and safety, because obviously a lot of the opposition, internal, external, comes from concerns about whether or not adequate care will be taken of water, especially in an area that's primarily used for agriculture, and air, and whether you have the regulations in place even in the pilot phase. So let me ask you that, is sort of how ready is Colombia from a regulatory point of view, and for example, have baseline studies been taken of water quality, air quality, et cetera, so that at the end of the pilot, you'll be able to measure impacts. Colombia will be able to measure impacts.
Well, I can start out, and I think Dr. Lloreda can absolutely complement and probably add a lot more on this front. The good news is that the vast majority of these blocks that have unconventional resources there in La Luna were bid out in 2012. And so we've had 8 years of institutional building. And there's been tremendous amount of best practices that have been implemented here. So for anybody that's actually dug into the weeds and looked at this, there's been a very, very long track record to undertake that kind of work. And given the fact that environmental issues are as sensitive as they are, and in an area like the Middle Magdalena with the Magdalena River flowing through, it's very vital. So environmental studies will still be undertaken once the pilot projects are bid out, and that will be a process that's part of this entire process to see, can you do this effectively? Can you do this in a sustainable kind of fashion? And that will then really determine whether from an environmental perspective and social perspective you can do this, and then whether commercially will there be parties interested in pursuing the projects.
Great. Ambassador, anything to add?
Yes, David, I would add the following, and it is first, I think Colombia already had a very robust regulation. And now the regulation that the government is enacting for the pilot projects is even more demanding, and not only demanding, is quite complex. And I would bet that perhaps we have one of the strongest or robust regulations regarding fracking worldwide. And we must remember also the real scope of the pilot projects. We are talking about drilling 8 wells, and in a region where there's an interesting play. So what we really expect is that with that regulation, we can do things the right way, in a responsible way. And let me tell you something that is happening, and it is, sometimes I ask myself, why is it that the anti-fracks, why are they, why do they oppose the pilot projects? And the only answer that I get, and that I think, is that they don't want the pilot projects to take place, because these pilot projects will show the country that it is possible to do fracking in a responsible way with the environment and with the social and the social communities. So, because why sometimes, if not, then how can we explain that they're afraid of these pilot projects? So we encourage the country, I say it again, to rely on scientific and technical information. And I have no doubt that if we do the pilot projects, the country will understand that it is possible to do this in a responsible manner.
David, I think that one lesson that we've learned from the U.S. tight oil and shale gas experience is that, sometimes environmental risk is just an environmental or public health question, but increasingly, sometimes environmental risk is also really a question of economic viability. And I think this is particularly true as we see the investment community starting to put some environmental and social metrics around their investing. And as we also see international governments starting to put some metrics around their trade. And to give just one recent example, in the United States, the EU is now considering a methane emissions standard on the gas that it imports that could actually result in US gas being boxed out of that market. Now, US gas producers really need LNG exports to survive. And I think this begs the question of whether, in retrospect, maybe stricter regulation of methane emissions would have actually been a pretty small price to pay for market participation. I think one thing that Colombia is doing well is just to summarize, being proactive rather than reactive here. I think when you're reactive, you can really, leave a lot on the table, not just in terms of public health and environmental well-being, but even in terms of investment opportunity.
No, it's a great point, Catherine. And in terms of regulatory capacity, I think Colombia is in a unique advantage in having had 8 years to get ready, whereas a lot of, Pennsylvania wasn't ready, when it first started. It had to play catch up from a regulatory point of view. Colombia has pretty highly qualified regulators, so they've got delay has been a bit of an advantage. But let me ask you something related to the, to the ESG point that Catherine just made, which is how this fits in with Colombia's commitment to the energy transition. Because, of course, some of the opposition, that you talked about, Francisco, comes from a belief that countries can get all the energy they need from renewables, and so I guess a couple of questions here. One, in terms of the emissions that would come, how will this fit in with Colombia's Paris commitments, and maybe more broadly, how, in terms of the nationally determined commitment that Colombia has adopted for its own pathway. How does gas fit in to that? And is it important, in fact, to Colombia's energy transition? Open that to anyone who wants it.
First, Colombia is committed to the Paris Agreement and is committed to reduce the emissions by 20%. We must remember that the contribution of Colombia to emissions worldwide is 0.4%. And what we have been telling the country is that the real and main challenges, environmental challenges that we have in Colombia, it is not hydrocarbons and it is not fracking. It is mainly deforestation. It has to do with illegal mining. We have some other main and major concerns regarding environment, but those are not very politically attractive issues, and especially for the media. So that's why they don't pick on them. And saying that, let me tell you, we have to be very, very realistic. And it is the energy transition will not take place homogeneously worldwide. Some regions, for example, in the case of Europe, perhaps will be able to go at a faster pace than, for example, than China, than North America, Latin America, or India. So we are expecting that each region will move at a different pace. And in the case of Colombia, it would be totally impossible to have like an energy transition express. That's impossible. We rely heavily on these resources and also on the revenues from this sector. And by saying that, let me tell you that Colombia has been doing a great job also in diversifying its energy grid. The government has incentive very much, not only solar and wind, but like 70% of the electricity that is produced in Colombia, it is from water. So we are at a we're standing at a very good position. So I summarize this, David, by saying that energy transition will not happen from night to day. First, second, we need these resources for the country, and Colombia's main environmental challenges has nothing to do with hydrocarbons and has nothing to do with fracking. That is just a very attractive and nice political flag, especially for politicians.
Thanks. I just want to remind the audience that we're taking questions. We're getting some excellent questions, which we've been filtering in, but please use the Q&A feature, which will open the window for you and let you ask a question. That's great, John. I saw you wanted to jump in on this one. Can you?
Yeah, if you could, yeah, because just to echo and then expand on a couple of items that Dr. Lloreda talked about. What Colombia, 70% is hydro, electricity is hydro. And so the issues that you really have are much more on kind of fuels. And some of those standards have absolutely been they're under revision. They've been improving those. And then there is, I think, and this is a real critical component that goes back to unconventional development, which is all of the illegal activity that you have there in the Middle Magdalena. So there's deforestation, there's illegal cattle ranching, etc. And when you don't have solid economic activities that are legal economic activities, it usually just benefits a few. It doesn't benefit a broad group of the communities. And so I think what unconventional development lends itself to, and what it presents the opportunity to do, is to actually really ensure that the economic activity and benefit is being seen and felt by those local communities. The royalty regime change is one step, but then there's going to still be a lot more activity that needs to be done. The government has absolutely made clear that they see unconventional development as part of that energy transition, and you need those resources. So even though Colombia is now OECD, it absolutely needs, it's not a rich country, and it's going to need that economic development to undertake it. And the last point I would make is just that, so Carlyle Investment just purchased the Oxy onshore assets. And Tony Hayward just recently, had said that, listen, ESG anywhere around the world, if you're in an extractive industries, it's got to be at the forefront of your development set. And so if you're going to pursue unconventional resource development, you have to have strong ESG. It's your calling card. And if you don't have it, it's not going to happen.
Very helpful. We have a question from our friend Jeremy Martin on whether the government's doing enough to solve the transport question and what more needs to be done to make Colombia's unconventional or conventional resources more competitive. Catherine, maybe if you could just jump in with a word about, I know you followed the sort of the transportation distribution question. Can you color this out a little bit, which is what's the issue for investors? What are people looking at?
Absolutely. This is a great question, and certainly one that we've been grappling with in North America for the last 10 years, or however long we've had this boom. And this is another great example of where it really pays to be proactive rather than reactive to the degree possible. As some of you may know, what happened in the United States is that all of our new oil and gas production in the last number of years cropped up in places where we had no oil and gas production previously. And in addition, some of our big demand locations shifted as well, which means that all of our existing infrastructure, from pipelines all the way to ports, we're kind of in the wrong place, so to speak. And these are not overnight capital investments. These are things that take some time to work through. And as a result, the industry has really had to grapple with just some absolutely massive price disconnects. And that's taken a good long while to work out, and in some cases is still being worked out. So I think this is certainly something to think through in advance. I always say that no matter how big your resource, no matter how inexpensive your resource is to produce, that's not the end of the story. You have to think through how do you get that resource to the right consumer in the right place at the right time. And John has spoken to this to some degree with respect to Colombia specifically, but this is what you need to think through. And what are your end markets as well? If you are relying on increasing domestic gas consumption, exactly how is that going to happen? And what sort of discussions need to be taking place now to foster that? If you are thinking about increasing exports, how exactly is that going to happen? This isn't just a matter of getting the oil and gas out of the ground.
Really helpful. So how will you evacuate this oil and gas from the Middle Magdalena? Francisco? Audio, please. You're on mute, Francisco.
There's something that John highlighted, and it is that the Magdalena, the Valley region, the industry has been there for more than 100 years. That's where the first wells that we have had in Colombia came from that region. So we have a good infrastructure for oil, and also we have a good infrastructure for gas. In the case of gas, however, we have like two gas markets, one in the northern coast and one in the center and also in the southwest of the country. And we need to connect them, and it is not very expensive to do that. And at the same time, what we need to do is to have a more a different tariff scheme in order to share the cost of transportation. And by saying that, I would also say that we still have many challenges regarding the cost of transportation on oil and also on gas in Colombia. In the case of tariffs for the transportation of oil, we think that it is very high. It is not very competitive, and so we've been discussing with the government some measures and procedures in order to lower those tariffs, because we need the country to be more competitive, not only as I was saying in oil, but also in gas.
John, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is a major issue. Transport costs are very high, and it's why you've seen the production decline that you've seen. Ecopetrol just 2 days ago with the release of their production and their results said that 15 to 20% of their reserves could be impaired. And that is, I think, indicative of just when you take a look at the reserves production, it's been going down. It's a big theme. And when those rate setting periods come up, it's going to absolutely be front and center. So Ecopetrol is the majority stakeholder in all of those oil evacuation transport systems. It generates a pretty significant amount of revenue for them. So we need to remember that 11.5% of their stock is traded publicly, and it has absolutely helped balance out their revenues and their profitability. So this is a big issue for the government in terms of how much revenue are you securing from the private sector and the overall activity of oil and gas, versus then the fact that you control 88.5% of the stock of Ecopetrol, and over 65% of oil is produced by Ecopetrol in the country. Over 80 some percent is of gas is produced by Ecopetrol as well. These are big issues, and they're complicated. They're very challenging, but it's going to be a topic that will absolutely come up as those rate setting sessions emerge.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience about oil price. In particular, what oil price does Colombia need for these pilot projects or for more extensive projects to succeed? If you're right now, we're looking at roughly $50, $50 crude. What price will, what's the hurdle rate for these projects, do you think?
I think on my end, I don't know if Dr. Lloreda has a view, or the ACP has a view on those prices. But I mean, I think you need to take as a benchmark what oil prices are in the country. And I mean, transport is a big component. So it's easily $8 to $10, and that's so it factors very, very heavily into your overall cost scheme. And so
$8 is the tariff?
For transport, to basically get it out to Coveñas, which is the main export facility that you have out of Colombia. So that then is precisely why you see the kind of production shut-ins that have taken place here in 2020. So the point is that you need to be, and then you've got to take taxes, you got to take royalties into consideration, et cetera. So you really need to be producing at levels that are lower than $20 a barrel, and particularly in the current environment, then that becomes much more challenging. So globally, I think we're in a dynamic where only the top end of the spectrum matters, but volume matters a lot. And so I think one of the big challenges that will be front and center with respect to unconventionals is there enough volume? Does this really now move the needle? And if you move the needle, then you can start talking about transport. You can reduce tariffs. You can then start moving product in a different kind of way that is much more economic and much more competitive, not only domestically but internationally.
Yeah. David, perhaps I want to add to what John was saying. That is, in the case of Colombia, we need a price range above $40 to $45 Brent, because as it was saying, we have a penalty for the quality of the oil, most of the oil that we have, and that penalty can be of $8 to $10 per barrel. And at the same time, as John was saying, moving a barrel of oil from the center of the country for export, the transportation cost can be above $7, $8. So it is. There's no well that is profitable with those in that situation. So that's why Colombia has been very, very dependent on what happens with international prices. First, second, that's why for us, it is very important to lower costs as possible as we can. And third, as John was saying, when we have these price crisis, the production goes down. And in May, production was slightly above 700,000 barrels a day. So, and in the case of unconventionals, I'm pretty sure that there's volume. What we've been discussing with the companies that the prospectivity of those plays is very, very important, but it requires a political will from different stakeholders in order to give fracking a chance, and that's what we think that the country should do.
I understand. One of the questions that's come in from the audience has to do with how representative these pilot projects are. So either geologically where they're located, or perhaps even environmentally in terms of their proximity to aquifers or important sources of water. How representative are the pilots of the greater area in which Colombia would hope to have unconventional exploration?
Let me give you some information, and it is in the Magdalena Valley region, the rock, the conventional rock that we're talking about, called the La Luna Formation. It is the same formation that goes to the Maracaibo Gulf in Venezuela. And in the case of what happens that in the case of in the side of Colombia, that we think that there's a lot of oil and gas which is trapped in the formation, while in the side of Venezuela it was not, and that's why Venezuela has like one of the main or second largest reserves, oil reserves, and also gas. And so in the case of Colombia, what we expect is that there are very good, has a very high potential. And from different studies, what we see regarding not only aquifers, but also information on geological information is it is possible to carry out fracking in a safe way. So that's why we should not be afraid of giving pilots a chance.
Right, but just to be precise, the question really isn't about the geologic prospectivity representative. The question is about whether they're ecologically representative. In other words, are there areas that are, if you come up with 4 pilots, I think the question is, will that really give you a sense of the ecological sensitivity? And this is in the context of, where the economic case for unconventionals is clear, but you're trying to build trust among the skeptics. So the question is, how have the projects been selected, and are they ecologically representative of the area?
There's actually there's 10 projects, or there's 10 E&P contracts that are available, and the potential bidders have the ability to choose which blocks they want to choose from. So they will clearly, or the expectation is that you will pick the best of the bunch as a starting point. But this is not a huge sample set that we're working from, right? So this is absolutely from a perspective of what you have available in terms of resource play. This is very, very concentrated. And so what happens in those pilot projects will be quite, I think, representative of what you're going to find if you start then getting a lot more activity.
But there's something else, John, and it is, although, yes, we're talking about four pilot projects, and it is in a very specific area, we think that it is an area where we'll be able to find important resources. And as I was telling you some minutes ago, for example, if these 4 pilot projects reach the production phase, when they mature enough, perhaps they will be able to produce more than 450,000 barrels a day. And perhaps and only these 4 pilot projects will be able to give Colombia gas reserves for more than 25 years. So I think that obviously it is just a very small piece of the territory, but what we expect is that only these pilot projects would be very, very significant if they reach production phase.
Right. We've got about 5 minutes left. So let me ask you the counterfactual question, and then I'll ask John. I'll ask you to start, and then Catherine, I want to get your opinion on sort of the macro impacts. But what does it look like for Colombia economically if it's not able to go forward? Does it become an oil importer? Does it have trouble meeting its other commitments? Does it have balance of payments issues? What's the counterfactual on this? John, let's start with you.
No, I think that hits to the core of the issue that's at stake and really has not been discussed here in Colombia by the current government or by the political opposition. So this administration has undertaken, like you've seen in a lot of other countries, quite a bit of debt. Debt to GDP is now up to 60%, and its ratings are, you have both Fitch and S&P that have BBB minus ratings with negative outlook. And the expectation is that the chances of downgrades are high. So if you don't have that revenue source, and if you take the view that oil prices will continue to decline, well, yeah, then you are going to be into a situation where you may not have some of the cheapest sources of production, and you're going to have to find other sources of revenue. That discussion is absolutely front and center. There's a lot of nuances here, and that's precisely, I would encourage everybody to read the report, because I've really attempted to kind of show a balanced approach in terms of what are the issues at stake. This is a very complicated issue. It's not a soundbite, not a one issue type of topic.
Great. Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes without saying that any hydrocarbons producer today should be dedicating a lot of time and strategic thought to diversification for both reasons of global climate agenda and just for outright economic reasons. So, that goes without saying. I think as we think about some of Colombia's macro challenges, as John was mentioning, increased debt, increased fiscal deficit, we can sort of try to make lemonade from lemons a little bit and say that as the peso has weakened over the last couple of years in a way that makes Colombia more attractive for an investment target. It's a relatively cheaper place to develop oil and gas than, say, the United States. But, I think we also have to think about what sort of position that puts Colombia in at the negotiating table. We may or may not go beyond these pilot projects, but if there is additional E&P investment required in the future, I think that Colombia has to think carefully about how they approach that in a strategic way. And, there's a lot of opportunities in those kinds of relationships as well. I think what John brought up about this chicken egg problem with you need the production to develop the infrastructure and you need the infrastructure to make the production economic. That would be a great conversation to weave into relationships with foreign investors. How do you sort of look at this holistically and make the whole thing work as opposed to just getting the oil and gas out of the ground?
Great. Helpful. We've just got a minute left. Francisco, I assume you agree on the importance of this going forward. Let me just say a couple things by way of wrapping things up. First, thank you all of our panels for a really excellent discussion. Thank you, John, for a really thorough, insightful, and very careful and dispassionate report on this. And I encourage anyone who cares about this issue to read it carefully. There are a lot of recommendations about what it's going to take to build trust. And I think as we've talked about today, these issues on how the projects were selected and how careful and prepared the government is to deal with health and safety, environmental issues, and how it harmonizes with the energy transition. All that's going to be really important to go forward. I want to say a few thank yous also before we leave to our leadership, to Jason Marzak and Randy Bell from the Adrian Arsh Center and the Global Energy Center. I want to thank the folks who helped this production go on, Camila Hernandez and Zeynep Wironen and Jackson Styron and Roger Morales, who make all this seem so effortless, but it's really not effortless. It takes an awful lot of work. I want to thank our translators for doing this together. And I encourage you all to, and lastly, thank the audience for your excellent questions and for your attendance. So please read the report, comment on it on Twitter if you like, and stay safe. Thank you.